1 Corinthians 2:12, and we have received God's Spirit, not the world's spirit, so we can know the wonderful things that he has freely given us. Do you see the relationship there between God's Spirit and knowing things so that we can know, Paul said? Then Paul quotes the prophet Isaiah in verse 16. He says, "For who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to teach him?" That's from Isaiah. And of course, the answer back when Isaiah said it was no one. They didn't dare think to know the thoughts of God. But Paul said, this has changed thanks to God's Spirit in us. He says, but we understand these things, for we have the mind of Christ. So just from these first couple chapters, we can recognize a few things about the mind of Christ. Number one, it's far, infinitely far better than human wisdom. That ought to be obvious. Secondly, the mind of Christ is the counsel and the example of Christ in you. And third, at this point in the letter, he alludes to the idea that the mind of Christ can help you get free from the stuff of the flesh, like divisions and envy. And later in the letter, he spells out more things having to do with sexual immorality and how to treat each other and even how to believe correctly. To Paul, having the mind of Christ is the key to exhibiting the kind of behavior in the flesh that reflects the real life in the Spirit. He didn't say create more rules. He didn't say do more or do better or discipline yourself more. He simply reminded them, hey, you have Christ's Spirit in you, so you know his thoughts on things. Let that direct you. This is even more fascinating when you realize that Paul wrote this to the Corinthians probably sometime in the early 50s. The first gospel wasn't written until likely the 70s, 20 years after Paul wrote Corinthians. So what this means is that they didn't have the advantage that we do today of having 4 books of Jesus stories to ask themselves and study about what would Jesus do or what did Jesus do. Of course, they had plenty of stories that were shared orally. I mean, the people were mostly illiterate back then, so they had to share orally, and they heard from real eyewitnesses. Pretty awesome. That's huge. But when Paul said, let the Spirit direct you, he really meant it, because they didn't have this book. They had to depend on the Spirit. So what were the thoughts of Christ that led them? Well, 2 things, actually. And we know this from both history and what's written in later New Testament letters. The thoughts of Christ that Paul's talking about are the same as the laws that we looked at in the last message, the laws written on our hearts. What other verses also say are written on our minds, inscribed on our minds. They are love and faith. If you go to 1 John chapter 3, verse 22, he says this. He's talking about obedience here, which, as I said last time, people get tripped up by that word obedience or obey. They automatically go back to the commandments. They go back to the law. Verse 22, he says, and we will receive from him whatever we ask because we obey him and do the things that please him. What are those things that please him? What does obeying him look like? Keep reading. The next verse tells us. Verse 23, and this is his commandment. We must believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another. Belief and love. That's what the Spirit is in us to testify of, to remind us of, to direct us according to. And isn't that what Jesus did all throughout his ministry? He launched his ministry saying, repent and believe the good news. Repent literally, metanoia is the Greek word. It literally means to change your mind. So right at the start, he says, I am here to change your mind about God, to change your belief, your faith about God, to show you who he really is. And read throughout the Gospels, story after story after story after story tells of the great lengths that Jesus went, sometimes shocking lengths, especially to those people back then. It tells about the ways that he showed that God is not mad, but God is love. God calls you his handiwork. That's because at your salvation, he recreated you with new gifts, qualities, and desires. In my new series, God's Work, I reveal why this means that living in peace, purpose, and holiness is easier than you ever knew. This 5-part audio series includes the following messages: the foreverness of forgiveness, your change of heart, accessing the mind of Christ, the believer's rights, and there's nothing wrong with you. Get my God's Work series today on 5 MP3s at kylewinkler.org/God's Work.